The subject of my speech is Are Children Right-Wing? This is quite an appropriate topic for me today because I have been babysitting a friend's twin 2-year-olds all day and trying to stop World War III from breaking out. So, yes, firstly, I think we should define what I actually mean by left and right wing, because at the moment there's quite a lot of confusion about this, and we can see that the boundaries have become quite blurred. For example, we often see political parties claiming to be left-wing but implementing right-wing policies, or we see people like our dear Emmanuel Macron, who claims to be apolitical but, well, to be neither right or left, but is actually quite right-wing. Anyway, I digress. So, in order to define left and right-wing, we need to go back to the French Revolutionary era. In the French Parliament at the time, the aristocrats who were in favour of the king used to sit on the right-hand side of the king, and the commoners who were in favour of the revolution used to sit on the left-hand side. This gave rise to the terms of left-wing and right-wing as we know them today. And it's funny to note that plenary sessions at the European Parliament are actually organised in the same sort of arrangement. So you have a sort of left to right spectrum with the extremes at either end. So for the purposes of this speech, which is obviously quite tongue-in-cheek, we can assume that when I say right-wing, I mean politics defending values such as individualism, authoritarianism, and survival of the fittest. And when I say left-wing, I mean the values of collectivism or socialism, freedom from power abuse, freedom from inequality, and defence of the underdog. So now we've defined what I actually mean by left-wing and right-wing, let's get back to the topic and try and establish whether children really are right-wing. In order to examine this topic, a study was carried out by a group of Swiss researchers from various universities from around Switzerland. The name of this study was Children's Political Beginnings, and the premise was to examine how children distribute resources in order to achieve equality, or not, as the case may be. What was actually done in these experiments is that puppets were used to act out scenes, and then the children's reactions were observed by the scientists. They carried out 2 experiments, and the first of these involved 173 children who watched a scene acted out by 2 puppets. These puppets were playing together, and there was one puppet which always chose the game and forced the other to comply. Then after the children had watched this scene, each child was given 2 chocolates, one big chocolate and one small chocolate, and they were asked to distribute these chocolates to one per puppet, and to decide which puppet should have the big chocolate or the little chocolate. The results of this were quite interesting because a clear trend emerged. It was seen that the majority of children aged 3 or 4 gave the big chocolate to the puppet that had been dominant, that is to say, the one which was always imposing its games on the other puppet. However, this trend disappeared amongst children aged 5, and there were quite mixed results among this age group. And then amongst the group of 8-year-olds, it was seen that this age group gave the big chocolate to the subordinate puppet, that is to say, the one who was always having to comply with the other one's game choices. So we can see that the trend actually completely reversed. To confirm these results, the scientists then carried out a second experiment. This involved 132 children who watched a scene in which 3 puppets were playing together. One of these puppets declared itself to be the boss, and again chose all the games and forced the other 2 puppets to comply with its choices. Then each puppet was given a number of coins. The dominant puppet was given 3 coins. One of the subordinate puppets were given 3 coins as well, and then the other subordinate puppet was given 2 coins. The children were then asked to take a coin from one of the puppets, that is to say, to take a coin from one of the puppets with 3 coins and to give it to the poorest puppet, which only had 2 coins. Again, quite a clear trend emerged. Younger children took the coin from the subordinate puppet, and older children took the coin from the dominant puppet. So what does all of this mean then? Well, when the children were asked to explain their choices, the younger children were quite simply unable to do so. They couldn't say why they had chosen to favour the interests of the dominant puppet. However, older children gave reasons such as, it's not fair because one of the puppets always chooses the game and the other one always never gets to decide what game to play, so it seems that they tried to compensate for this inequality. The researchers suggested they suggested several reasons for the difference between age groups. Firstly, they suggested that younger children are more dependent on parental figures of authority, so they're more likely to protect the interests of the puppet perceived as dominant. Another reason suggested is that at nursery school or kindergarten, there are often very pronounced relationships of dominance between children, and these are quite common and fairly well accepted by nursery school staff. So younger children act in a manner to curry favour with dominant children and to avoid conflict with these. However, as children grow up and as their social life becomes more complex, they become more interested in evening out social inequalities because they see that otherwise their friendship groups take a turn for the worse. The scientists noticed that children become sensitive to social inequalities around the age of 5 years old, and this trend continues as the child gets older. But this doesn't necessarily mean that all children above the age of 5 years old are little egalitarians. The scientists said that the scientists wish to carry out further experiments, for example, to find out whether gender or cultural differences play a role in this, whether children would treat a male puppet differently, for example. But the real question is, if at the age of 8 we're all extremely sensitive to inequalities, then why do some people grow up to be Theresa May, for example, and other people grow up to be Jeremy Corbyn? Well, there are obviously many factors which explain this. But one reason that's been unearthed by scientists is that according to where we are on the political spectrum, we actually use different parts of our brain, and our brain reacts in different ways to certain situations. It's been found that strong emotions such as disgust or fear or hatred are strongly linked to a right-wing political orientation. Tests have shown that people who define themselves as right-wing have stronger reactions of disgust, for example, when shown images such as, disgusting images, basically. They are more likely to have, in the tests carried out, they were more likely to have very visceral gut reactions. And scientists also carried out brain scans on a number of people with different political orientations, and they found that people who define themselves as right-wing have a more highly developed amygdala, which is a part of the brain involved in processing very strong emotions such as fear, disgust, etc. And we can imagine how this might come into play when, for example, somebody reads a story in a tabloid newspaper about crime levels among immigrants, for example, and then the part of the brain, this amygdala, involved in processing disgust and fear comes into play, and then people are unable to objectively analyse the situation and have a very strong gut reaction, which makes them not like foreigners. And as we know, our brain connections are reinforced the more we use them. So it's no surprise that when people find themselves in a situation where they feel threatened or unsafe, whether this is related to financial issues or security issues, that In this situation, we see the rise of the extreme right, as we are currently seeing all across Europe. Anyway, there's no doubt that more scientific research is required into a topic which is so complex as the brain, and a topic which is so poorly understood. After a full day of babysitting 2-year-old twins, I can tell you that there's also no understanding 2-year-olds. But I'm very glad to know that in around 3 years' time, I can expect that they will finally agree to share their toys and no longer fight over the last biscuit.